Welcome back to another episode of the Rise Over Run podcast. I am Doug Barnett. I'm here with my partner, co-founder, Brant Choate.
What's up?
So we just did like this series interviewing our employees, some of our leaders around what it took to get hired at Remy and how we think about getting hired at Remy. We're going to flip that on its head today and talk about how not to get hired. Here's what you should do if you don't want to get hired. And the list of mistakes that you can make is pretty long.
Yeah.
And so I made a LinkedIn post, I don't know, it's probably been a couple weeks now, on like what our hiring funnel looked like. Just trying to peel back the layer, like the curtain a little bit and say like, I promise you we're not as neglectful as people tend to assume of like, throw your resume in the ring and like see what happens and like people don't even pay attention.
Like, because we don't respond is what you're saying?
Yeah, like it's and it's completely overwhelming for a team our size. We had like 8,000 applications since April. We've hired 40 people. And only 20 of those people from the 8,000 applicants came from that pool. The other half came from non-Ashby related. Ashby's our ATS.
Referrals.
Yeah. People that we maybe knew or that people that we knew them.
Yep.
Some amount of networking that's happened here. That post got put up in front of some college kids recently. One of them tagged me on a LinkedIn post. Super sincere, clearly smart and talented young man. And he said like my post kind of changed his thinking where he was thinking 80% of my effort into getting a job has got to be focused on my skills and 20% on my network. And he said that my post changed his thinking to like 80% of his effort needs to be put into networking and 20% on skills. What would you say to that?
I mean, you can kind of see how he ended up there. I don't know. I just think at the end of the day, especially for what I'm hiring for, like personality and like how they got in the door is not necessarily like super high up on my list. They have to stand out somewhere, of course, and networking helps. But, you know, if they still can't code or they can't design or product manage,
not getting hired.
Doesn't help the cause.
I think that, and I kind of messaged him and said, look, I think the reframing that I would take here is skills are without question the single most important thing that you can do to get hired. But if you have great skills and no one knows it, your job search is going to be harder. And in our conversation with Sam, we talked about this, where his resume was not something that would have led us to understand his skill set, which is extremely strong. Having a friend that actually knew what his skills were enabled us to get him in the door and really understand what that looked like. And so, you know, what are some of the common mistakes that we see in hiring? I think we should start kind of thinking about this through the lens of a job seeker. Where does a job seeker start? Where are the very first places that they start to look for jobs? And what are the common mistakes that we see at this particular step? What is the first thing that you would call out here? What are the mistakes?
I mean, I think like the very, very first thing is deciding what they even want to do, who and thus like what companies should I target? And it's very obvious kind of at the first step in the process that we interact with, which is like we get a resume, the people that are just spraying and praying versus the people that have specifically targeted Remy as a place that they want to work. And, you know, I'm always going to choose the people that have some perspective on what they want to do with their life, thus have targeted Remy, than, you know, a resume that shows up where it's very obvious it's just kind of going out to 500 other companies.
We had by the way, I think this person we're like pretty close to making an offer to. Very, very sharp candidate. Come in this week for I think it was the third interview. Our leader that was interviewing him wanted to get a feel for the other places that he was putting his resume. And he's like, well, I'm interviewing with this restaurant chain right now. And it was kind of like, huh? What do you mean? You're interviewing at Remy, tech startup, they want to become a large company, work in the technology space, and you're also interviewing for a restaurant. Why? And one of the things that I see here, common mistake, you're saying like, make the decision of who you want to be. There is nothing wrong with interviewing in the restaurant chain. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. In fact, if you want to go specialize in food or in the hospitality industry, there's nothing wrong. It is so fundamentally different than what we do at Remy. You've just got to make some decisions about why you're choosing to interview in hospitality. And I think a lot of, especially early career people, but to be honest with you, there are many people 10, 15, 20 years into their careers that have not even thought about this. Why do you want to work at Remy versus why do you want to go work at a restaurant chain? And that's a pretty clear example of like making a decision. Giving thought as to what those companies need and why you are a good fit or why you're even interested is another example here that kind of pairs alongside this.
Underlying all these questions, it's experiences that we've had in hiring where, you know, you're kind of like, okay, I don't think this person knows quite what they want, evidenced by some of these things. We're going to like hire them anyways. What tends to happen more often than not is that you become almost like a personal therapist to help them figure out what they want to do and how to make sense of, you know, this like fork in the road in their life. And if it's between two things that are like so markedly different, you end up like having these conversations that are something along the lines of like, hey, I chose to work at a startup and now I'm being asked to like make these trade-offs in my life, sacrifices. I have to work harder, I have to do longer hours and whatever, but my other option did not include those things. Maybe I should have picked those things. And they're always kind of like doing the grass is greener thing. And, you know, it's just kind of an exhausting thing from the manager perspective to have to like reconvince someone that they like made the right choice over and over and over. Look, no one's going to know with like 100% certainty that like Remy is the thing. Like there's always going to be some other options, whatever. I don't have any illusions about that. But when it's like 50-50, it just doesn't ever go well.
And what that requires is someone needs to be able to look at a company and make a determination about what are the things about this job that are going to impact my life. I don't even work there yet, but you can get a lot of signal about what a company is trying to accomplish, who are the types of people that work there. But I think that there's this level of desperation when you're not employed that I'm just gonna throw it everywhere. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And you've just got to get really, really honed in so that I think this is like, I really do believe maybe this is the number one mistake that people are making is they don't know what they want from a company. And maybe this is a confidence issue because they're probably thinking only, does a company want me? Well, also they need to be thinking, do I want the company? And there's, you know, through this lens, you know, I'm having this conversation with a family member who's just out of high school. And basically, if, you know, you could come maybe get a job at the lowest rung, come refill snacks at Remy, make a few bucks an hour, or go work at a fast food chain. What do you want? Like just forcing him to think about what is going to change in his life between these two job opportunities. But almost no adults are thinking about this because the desperation to pay the bills overtakes all like logic in their brain, but it literally destroys your ability to actually solve the problem in the first place. I think connected to this issue of trying to figure out where to go work and why, and we've talked about solutions here lots of times now across the podcast of like the way you can go solve these problems. Let's maybe take it one layer below that, just slightly below that, which is your resume. What are the biggest mistakes that you see people make on a resume?
I think between like resume and then maybe you could say like cover letter, or sometimes you get an email with, some kind of blurb in it. Those two things together, it's me trying to make an assessment about how this person thinks, communicates, and then also objectively like what their accomplishments are, and if I can kind of map all those things together and say like, yeah, this is a match. And specifically, if I were to take, I don't know, let's just take like an engineer. The really, really great engineers are also great communicators in a way. It's different than talking to people in a lot of cases, but they can take like really complex topics and explain them to you, in simple terms.
By the way, one of our super genius engineers literally just did this in a meeting not less than an hour ago.
Yeah, just to be clear, like this isn't that they have like great public speaking skills.
Nope.
It's not any of that stuff. But when you get them on a topic that they know about, they can communicate it in clear terms, like at a minimum to other engineers. And that comes through in a resume. And like the really bad resumes look something like this. It's 4 pages long, these big long paragraphs that don't tell me anything. They're just filled with words and I don't know, the like buzzwords of certain sorts. And you can tell that they're either trying to like encapsulate like all of the impact that they've ever had, and basically like more is better in a way is like a big foot gun in a resume. And I think like not having any sort of appreciation for this other side of what it's like to go through 8,000 resumes it comes through in like how they communicate. Like a good version of a resume has as many like quantifiable things as possible. It's not possible with every single thing, but a great engineer might say something like, I re-architected this core system at my previous company and we saved X amount of money, or it increased the speed by this much, or it allowed, 10 times more developers to onboard into our system. There's ways to quantify all this stuff. And you can tell also when someone is like specifically responsible for a thing, or they're just like, we're a part of it. Just by like kind of how they talk, like that's maybe another thing I'm always trying to parse through in looking at a resume.
Do you know what's interesting? This is not a whatnot, but just something I'm thinking about on resumes specifically. Rather than trying to take credit for something that happened, just say, I was on the team that did this. I'm looking to lead something like this in the future. No one does that stuff, but it's very enlightening as you're thinking about like ambition and the honesty that can come through in a resume. On the resume side, so the last time I actually had a resume, I was thinking about this while you were talking, 2007. And I have loads of people like this. I have people staring at me right now as part of this podcast that haven't had a resume in a long time. And because there's certain things that you begin to pick out about the way people talk about their careers, where you figure out pretty quickly, like, is this somebody that makes impacts or tries to come up with ways to justify that they made an impact? And whether you believe it or not, it is so clear if you've done this long enough from a hiring perspective. One of the biggest mistakes, this is independent of resumes, that little weird thing that LinkedIn does that you describe yourself. It's not your job title. Mm-hmm. That's like later on down your profile. But like you give a summary of yourself.
Yeah.
If that isn't just your job, if it's like basically like your sizzle reel, essentially, instant turn off to me.
Yeah.
Because usually what I've found is the people who make really big impacts like that, or that actually do it, they are not busy hyping up what they've done. They're just busy doing the work.
Yeah, and maybe like something to differentiate here. Like if we're talking about early career professionals, you kind of have to rely on the resume a lot more. Like, let's just say your first 4 or 5 years of working.
Yep.
But yeah, I think the really great people, your point is good. The really great people kind of post that. They get pulled into other places like over and over and over. Yeah, I don't think I've made a resume since 2010 maybe.
Yeah. But paired alongside, you talked about this in a former episode, the open to work badge on LinkedIn is a signal that you just don't care. And people are like, that's the rudest thing you've ever. It is. What it means is like you're not willing to work hard enough to have a network that can vouch for you, and you want everyone to vouch for you when no one really knows what makes you great. I'm just telling you, the open to work badge and then the sub headline with like your sizzle reel, you are making it very hard on yourself to get hired before we even look at your resume. Because it's communicating a couple things that you may not even realize about how many people that we talk to. Now we've talked about like, okay, how does your top of funnel work and what mistakes do we see people make? And now one layer below that is, okay, I need to put myself out into the world, and specifically resume. Now let's talk about communication. Like, your resume is one way you communicate about yourself, but also in an application or in a text message to a friend to set up an interview, or in an email that you're sending to an executive, etc. What are the biggest mistakes that you see here?
I think maybe like 2 things. Like, there's just, I don't know, basic communication skills that can be off, like poor grammar, slow to respond. Like, maybe just you could classify it as adding friction to the process. Like, if someone forwards me a resume and it's just like, hey, here's my buddy, it's like, okay, I don't know, I'll probably look at it. But if someone forwards me a resume and then there's also a blurb along with it that the candidate wrote that they like wanted passed along, and it kind of indicates why they want to talk and why they think they're great for Remy, I mean, it's just a fairly different pass along. And then maybe a step further is like, here's a way to talk to me, here's a scheduling link, here's something. If I have to then, if I don't have any of that stuff and it's like just resume passed along, it's kind of going to end up in the same spot, if I'm being honest, as like all the other ones that come in, and unless this is like a really great friend and I feel some personal accountability to kind of dive in and look at it. But very few referrals are actually that way. It's like I get a referral from someone I worked with 15 years ago and I haven't talked to since, or I get a referral from like I mean, this happened actually last week. It was like someone I had one phone conversation with that like wanted to work here and I didn't give them a job. It's like, why am I gonna look at your referral? Like, anyways, I just think lack of clarity, or like making it easy for acknowledging that I have thousands of resumes to look through. Like, just that fundamental
empathy
piece of empathy is just not there a lot of times.
I do think that this can be boiled down to empathy. All this stuff of like having some level of care and understanding for who's on the other side of the equation here. I'll give you an example. We have some friends. Well, technically, they're my wife's friends. I don't know them well. And he got laid off after 23 years at the same company, basically from the beginning of his career. Not his fault in any way. Like, the company had a catastrophic problem. So of course, they're working every angle that they can. I mean, that's devastating.
Yeah.
Right? So I get this note from my wife. That's someone I trust, I hope. But she doesn't, it's not her responsibility to make the candidate look good, right?
Yeah, or screen even.
Or yes, that's actually not her job at all. She's like, my husband runs a company, you know that. So when the request comes, she's gonna pass it to me. What I would have loved to have seen is just this quick note. Doug, I got laid off after 23 years.
Yeah.
Total shock. I know when looking at my resume, it probably doesn't match to exactly what you guys are doing at Remy. I've spent some time researching. You can do this in an hour, by the way. I've spent some time researching, Remy. Super interesting what you're working on. I've got skills in this area. I imagine you guys have needs here. I would love the chance to come meet. Vulnerable, honest, concise. If someone sends a note like that alongside, and by the way, when Brandy gets the resume, it should come along with the blurb.
Right.
That just says, hey, this is what's going on in my life. This is what happened. Even if we can't make a fit here, I am so much more likely to go help that person at whatever the next step is and advocate for them. But there is so little care usually put into it. And look, 23 years, probably don't know how to get a job anymore. So I've got some empathy. And I did pass the resume along, and I did make sure that that we took care of it. It's way more likely that you're gonna get success with just this modicum, this very, very small amount of understanding of what's happening on the other side of the equation.
And not that this happened here, but I think a lot of people's mentality, if we're talking about people that have been laid off or like actively looking for a job, that, that mind space is hard to be in, especially the longer it goes on. And I think counterproductive behaviors creep in over time. And it's this desire to hide, to obscure details, to like try and make it even seem in some cases like I wasn't laid off. It also is sort of this feeling that gets way counterproductive, and people will start to be like, I didn't deserve to be laid off, and so I'm like really great actually, and like open to work and spray out my resumes, and like I'm gonna show this company that laid me off like I'm gonna have a job in no time. And it's almost this like denial of sorts about just it's unrelated to their skills a lot of times. It's like company had to do a layoff, cool, whatever. But also from my side, I don't want to have to like parse through the details of why you got laid off. Like if that comes in the note along with it, way easier to make sense of and way higher chance that I'm gonna ever talk to you.
And by the way, I want people who are honest. I would much rather you just told me the bad news and why it happened and that it sucks. This stuff happens. Like we're empathetic. We want people to be gainfully employed. And if there was a real reason why it happened, it is what it is. But like own it, move on. I often say this in interviews that people always want to give this picture of perfection in a job search. I want, as a hirer, the exact opposite. I want you to know why you're not good, where you're great, and own it. And I think people make the mistake of this like obscuring the truth, because it's not really dishonesty. It's like I'm just gonna build a wall around these things that I don't want them to look at. I wanna see what those are because they really help me make a decision of if you have a core weakness in this area, I'm just not gonna hire you. And if I can't tell it, I'm probably not gonna hire you anyway.
You know what the worst version of this is where they are so in denial about a given limitation or a reason they got fired or whatever, that they actually like can't see it. And so then when you talk to them, or if you do hire these people, it feels like they're lying to you all the time because they are so convinced that they don't have this problem because it's like a self-protective mechanism, that you repeatedly have these conversations where you're like, no, you do have this problem. And like, we can work through it, but you need to acknowledge that it's a problem.
Yep.
And they're just like, no, I don't. You can't solve, like you never will solve that if someone can't, like actually acknowledge it. And so, we try and actually sniff this out quite hard in our interview process.
Because of the downstream consequences of when we don't.
It's poison.
It's the worst thing that can happen in a culture.
Yep.
Okay, let's say you did pretty good at all this. What are the mistakes that we see people make in a technical type of screen? We're gonna go do an intro call and get
Yeah.
to know somebody. Oh, your resume looks pretty good. Now we're gonna go skill test you. That's the next step of the process. Where do people make big mistakes here?
I think like aside from just failing our screens, like they're fairly binary. We have a scoring system. You pass, fail. There's maybe people that will get, let's just say they're like 10% off of our pass, fail, and they're young in their career, but they don't communicate well all throughout the interview. And this might be like a coding interview where we're giving them something fairly challenging. We know that it's going to be hard to get through in an hour, but we just kind of want to see like how they will do under some amount of pressure and get as far as they can. And when they don't communicate about like what they're thinking about, and it's kind of just this like silence, like type, and you just sit there as the interviewer and kind of watch them struggle, it doesn't give me any sense about like how they think. So the flip side of this, just to hit the point home, one of our very best engineers actually like didn't cross over the bar that we had initially set for one of our interviews, but he talked out loud the whole time about the fundamentals of programming and what he was trying to accomplish, and had such mastery over that I was just like, oh, he just hasn't spent as much time with JavaScript, and there's like some syntax, things that you can fill in the gap in a week, tops. And once he learns that, he will be one of our best engineers. So, I think giving yourself as much opportunity to kind of show how you think, talk this is where I'm stuck. I'm trying to think through this right now, and asking questions. It just gives me as an interviewer a lot easier time to like give someone a bit of, maybe like a bit of leeway in getting over our line.
So what mistakes did people make before if they just failed the technical screen? Like what? Okay, that was the result. You failed.
Yeah.
But what are the mistakes that led up?
Led up to it.
Yeah, that led up to that.
I think in like the R&D disciplines, it's probably lack of understanding of core tooling. So like I could say a designer, I mean, you can kind of be a designer at lots of companies and no one's gonna like come in and see if you're clicking fast enough across Figma or Sketch or whatever tool you're using. But the proficiency with that tool is actually very important. Like it can be a difference of something getting done like 3-5 times faster. And if you don't really know where you stand on something like that, like if you haven't gone to YouTube and watched like amazing designers or had the pleasure to work alongside great designers, like if you have any question about where you stand with something like that, you should go like figure it out. And it's easy. Go to YouTube. Look up great Figma designers. You'll probably fail in like a technical interview, at least at Remy, because like we really care about that. It's the same thing with code. We get people that come in, they don't seem to know how to use like the code editor in like very simple ways. There's like basics around just things that make you fast at reasoning through coding that they don't seem to know. And I think the challenge, at least with like, my side of the business, is that all of these roles at certain companies you can kind of hide. Like if it was just you and an engineer working on a project, you can't really gut check them on this type of stuff.
No, I cannot.
And so they can be like, hey, this is going to take 3 weeks, and you just kind of have to deal with it. But there are underpinnings of, what makes something 2 days versus 3 weeks that we really dive into. And, I think if you don't know if you're good, you're probably not. and
Are
you need to
there
go figure out who is.
are there ways for people to figure it out on their own? Are there examinations? Are there like little quizzes that people can take to get an understanding of like, how do I measure up?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the design side, if you were to go to YouTube, you can look up like Figma speed running even. Like they have competitions over who can design stuff the fastest. You'll get a sense of how fast you can actually be just coming up with solutions in the design world. You could also just spend time looking at what big company UX does. There's sites that spell out like what great usability looks like, great UX looks like. So it's like unrelated to speed, but just more of the quality side of this thing. And they lay it out for every company you could possibly think of. You could type in like Airbnb onboarding flows and it shows you all the screens.
Wow.
So there's like I have like no sympathy for people that haven't taken the time to do this type of stuff. The coding side, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. There's competitive programming, there's Elite Code, there's all these code challenge websites. You can get a sense of how fast you are at reasoning as one thing. There's all these job interview sites that talk about the most common things people ask. There's all like, there's a lot out there, and I think it can be hard to parse through all this stuff, but you can always tell at a minimum who's even attempted versus just like, well, I got a job as an engineer at a college and it was at like a bad company and I like just made their stuff and now I'm here and I'm gonna make stuff for you. And I don't know how good I am, but I don't know. It's just fairly obvious, I think, when you talk to these people who's even tried.
The last thing that I just want to talk through is in-person interviews. What are the core mistakes? Let me tell you one that I just saw very recently. At some point in the interview, I'm going to ask a candidate if they have any questions for me. Can you tell me why I'm going to ask that question?
You want to see how much they understand about the business. You want to see if they know basically like things that you care about. You want to see how they like solve problems. Like what are the first things they go to in their mind? I mean, it shows you how they think.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm trying to screen for. And also, usually this is towards the end of the interview, and we've had a discussion. They've had now 15 to 30 minutes with me, and I've been usually answering questions, and it's been an active discussion. I did this recently, and the candidate had some prepared questions that they probably got from some interview site or something, and they asked me these questions. Like they were like semi-interesting, but also like that's nothing to do with the rest of the things we talked about in this interview.
They almost feel like they're like out of a fortune cookie or something weird.
It does
like,
actually
like,
very much like what it feels like.
Yeah.
And it came out after, and this is like why it's a mistake. They asked the exact same questions to everyone in all the interviews.
Yeah.
Well, what does that show? That you didn't actually listen in the interview. You weren't really tuned in to what people were saying, and you just came with prepared remarks, essentially, and like forced the interviewer to put them on stage, which is fine. I'm okay answering hard questions, but if they're not really relevant to it doesn't progress the sale, is what Reno would say here, which is if you're trying to get hired, this is a sales process. Your questions should progress the sale. And it's a really big mistake people make, is like, you gotta get your questions to be right. And it requires you to listen in the interview and then find something that is interesting, once again, back to curiosity and like being caring, things that are like really important to us at Remy. It's a really big mistake people make. Just random fortune cookie question.
Yeah, and I think even like hitting that point home of furthering the sale, it's actually in a lot of cases kind of your only time to kind of, I don't know, push aside the formality of an interview and like almost get into more of a conversation
personal
that feels human.
Yep.
And so if it still just kind of carries on like that, you you walk away as the interviewer and you forget that person ever existed like 2 days later, is just the honest truth. And the people that actually are like, okay, I'm talking with the CTO right now. I'm going to ask you like CTO specific questions. And I think I now have an understanding of, what this person cares about. And I'm going to like dive in deeper. Some of the good questions I think people have asked me are like, how do you guys do like your planning process and make sure that like design, product, and engineering are all kind of like rowing in the same direction?
Good question.
It's generic, but it's still like a good question that leads into like, how does Remy work?
Yep.
How does Remy make sense of this thing that's really hard to get right? Because that's going to affect me, and I want to make sure that I line up as an interview, like as the interviewee, with how this CTO in my case is like making sense of all this stuff.
By the way, the more we talk about, the madder I'm getting about this topic, because you know who you're going to interview with before. You can go figure out pretty easily what these roles of these people are.
Yeah.
And you can literally go to ChatGPT and say, this is the type of company that I'm interviewing for. This is the roles of the people that I'm interviewing for. Give me good questions for each of those roles. And it will literally just spit it out for you. It's that easy. And so it's just, if you do this, it's literally like tripping over your own shoelace. You're just not getting hired because you weren't even thoughtful enough to even use an AI for 5 minutes to come up with some answers here. That is lazy and not caring at all for the people that you're interviewing for or the job that you're trying to get.
This is really hard, I think, for some reason, specifically for technical people to get right. So much so that I actually have a good buddy whose whole job for the last 10 years is just to help existing engineers get better jobs. He's helped thousands of people do this at this point, to every company you can imagine, big companies, small companies. All that they really do is just make them mock interview the technical side and then like this kind of more personal side. And it's basic stuff, just like how to ask good questions. Here's how to answer some of the more technical side. In some cases, these people triple their salaries.
Wow.
Like they go from 150 to 450, 500, just on this. Like they have the underlying skills, they just are not putting it all together as the final piece. And it's been interesting because I have people in my life who I've tried to help kind of move up in their career. And I point this friend out. They want nothing to do with it. They're just like, I don't need this. I'm 10 years into my career. What do you mean? I've been XYZ, blah, blah, blah. Like, are you happy with how much money you're making? Are you happy with your title? Are you happy with your career progression? No. Well, what are we talking about? Like, this is the reason. And I know it for these people because I know them well. So I don't know, it's hard to get out of your own way sometimes.
Yeah, in a job process, like just talking through this, humility, curiosity, willingness, work ethic, the desire to put in the work, you don't have to do much to stand out because a lot of people make a lot of these. Most people are making these mistakes.
Yep.
So, okay, well, hopefully people are able to get some information out of this. We really, 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 really want talented people to work here. And hopefully if they can begin to understand some of these mistakes that they're making, we can easily hire and find more of them quicker. So we will wrap this episode up. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We will catch you guys on the flip.
See ya.